Marcus Webb walked into First Heritage Bank on a Tuesday morning in March, holding his daughter's hand. Amara was 7. She had a backpack on, the one with the worn-out zipper, because Marcus was dropping her at school right after this. He wore a navy work jacket with a small tear on the left sleeve, the kind of jacket you patch instead of replace. He slid a printed, slightly wrinkled account statement across the counter to the branch manager, a man named Bradley Coons. Bradley was in his mid-30s, his tie a little too tight, the kind of guy who'd memorized the bank's sales script better than he'd ever learn a customer's name. Bradley glanced down, didn't even pick it up. "Sir, this is an OTC pink sheet stock. We don't even clear these types of assets at a retail branch level. This account statement isn't something we can leverage for a line of credit." Marcus didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He just nodded, slow, almost rehearsed, the same nod he gave every time somebody decided who he was before they bothered finding out. He folded the statement, slid it back into his jacket, and said, "We'll come back next week." Amara looked up at him as they walked out. "Why'd that man laugh, Daddy?" "People laugh at things they don't understand, baby. Come on, you're gonna be late." That's it. That's the whole scene. No raised voices, no security called, just a man getting underestimated in under 90 seconds on a Tuesday in a strip mall bank branch in Greensboro, North Carolina. And 11 days later, a high-priority alert from the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond landed directly on the desk of First Heritage's chief legal counsel at corporate headquarters. I want you to sit with that for a second, because the gap between those two moments, a guy getting brushed off at a local branch counter and a regional Federal Reserve Bank triggering an urgent corporate compliance review, that gap is basically the entire story of how wealth actually hides in this country. Not in mansions, not in yachts, in quiet equity that looks worthless until suddenly it isn't. Here's who Marcus Webb actually is, since Bradley clearly didn't ask. 38 years old, maintenance supervisor at a freight logistics depot off I-40, raises Amara alone. His wife passed when Amara was 2 and he never remarried, never really talked about it much either. Works second shift sometimes so he can do school pickup. Drives a 2011 Camry with 190,000 miles on it. By every number a bank teller glances at, income, car, zip code, Marcus Webb looks like a typical working-class guy living paycheck to paycheck. And honestly, that's the part of this story that bothers me the most, because the entire commercial banking system is built to read immediate income as a proxy for wealth, and those two things are not the same thing, not even close. Let's talk numbers for a second, because I think people skip past this too fast. According to the Federal Reserve's Survey of Consumer Finances, the typical white family in America has a median net worth roughly 6 times that of the typical black family. That gap actually widened post-2020, even while minority wealth was technically growing. Growth from a tiny base still leaves you with a tiny number. Nobody talks about that part either. Marcus knew that gap existed before the Fed ever published a single chart about it. He just decided to do something most people in his income bracket get talked out of. He stopped treating his paycheck as the final goal and started treating it as fuel. Back in 2013, a coworker mentioned a tiny local institution, Heartland Community Bank shares, ticker HRTL, trading on the over-the-counter market for 38 cents a share. Thinly traded, no Wall Street analyst coverage, the kind of penny stock a mainstream financial advisor would laugh you out of the room for mentioning. And honestly, most advisors would be right to. Most microcap stocks go straight to zero. I want to be clear about that, because this is not a buy penny stocks video. This is the exact opposite of that video. What made Marcus different wasn't just the pick, it was the behavior. He put in $4,200 of savings, money he'd built up doing side electrical work, and then he just kept buying, every single paycheck, a little more. He set up his brokerage account to automatically reinvest every dividend instead of cashing it. He did this quietly for 11 years while everyone around him assumed a man in a patched work jacket didn't have 2 nickels to rub together. Here's the psychology part, because this is what actually separates people who build wealth from people who don't, and it has nothing to do with IQ. Wealthy households overwhelmingly hold assets,
businesses, real estate, equity, while working households hold income. Income gets taxed the moment it lands and spent the moment it's taxed. Assets sit there, compounding, invisible, until something forces them into view. To understand how powerful this is, look at how entire nations build economic survival strategies. Japan, Mochi-ai, after decades of post-war rebuilding, Japanese conglomerates developed a system of cross-shareholding. Firms quietly held each other's stock for decades, completely ignoring daily market noise. Patience as a core corporate strategy. Singapore, Central Provident Fund, the state forces citizens to park a massive chunk of every paycheck into long-horizon accounts they can't easily touch, letting time do the heavy lifting. Switzerland, their rigid three-pillar pension system enforces the exact same behavior structurally. Different cultures, same underlying law of math. Take the decision to spend out of your own hands and let time do the rest. Marcus basically built his own one-man version of that in North Carolina. No corporate pension committee, just a guy doing by pure instinct what entire nations design economic policy around.
So why did Bradley laugh? Because on the retail banking terminal in front of him, HRTL showed up as a sleepy, illiquid ticker that hadn't seen an updated price quote in days. In fin trading, when almost nobody is buying or selling, the last printed price looks dead, even while the underlying business is doing just fine. To a retail branch manager glancing at a piece of paper for 10 seconds, it read as an unleverageable joke. That's not Bradley being uniquely evil, that's just how the modern consumer banking industry treats illiquid small-cap equities. They are built to read the loudest numbers, not the patient ones. What Bradley didn't know, what nobody at that local branch had any reason to know, is that over the previous 6 years, Heartland Community Bank shares had been quietly acquiring 4 other small community banks across the Piedmont region. Slow, unglamorous, regulator-approved mergers, one tiny bank swallowing another tiny bank year after year. It was the kind of growth that never makes the evening financial news because it's boring. But then, the tipping point happened. Heartland completed a long-pending structural uplisting from the OTC Pink Sheets to the NASDAQ Capital Market. For the first time in over a decade, its newly combined balance sheet, now holding just over $1.5 billion in assets, got priced by actual institutional Wall Street buyers. The stock didn't just double. When real institutional volume hit a tightly held stock with a very small public float, the price surged from its historical pennies to north of $18.50 a share in a matter of weeks. By this time, through 11 years of aggressive accumulation and dividend reinvestment, Marcus Webb didn't just own a few shares. He owned exactly 9.8% of the company's outstanding stock. And that number, 9.8%, is the actual hinge this entire story turns on. Not the dollar figure, the percentage. Here's the regulatory detail almost everyone misses when they tell stories like this. And honestly, it's my favorite part because it's so unglamorous, it barely sounds like a movie scene at all. Under the Change in Bank Control Act, federal regulators strictly monitor who owns American banks. If an investor hits a 10% ownership threshold, it triggers a mandatory, exhaustive review by the Federal Reserve. It requires formal prior notice, background checks, and an investigation into the source of funds to ensure bad actors aren't quietly seizing control of local banks. At 9.8%, Marcus was sitting right under that strict 10% statutory tripwire. But because Heartland was uplisting to the NASDAQ, the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond conducted a routine compliance audit of all major shareholders holding more than 5% of the company's stock. When the Fed looked at the SEC filings, they saw a massive block of nearly 1.2 million shares held under a passive institutional brokerage account owned by a single individual, Marcus D. Webb. The Fed's Banking Supervision Desk immediately contacted Heartland's corporate compliance team to verify his identity and ensure he wasn't acting in concert with other investors to illegally bypass the 10% control limit. Corporate panicked.
They looked up Marcus's file and realized his primary everyday checking account was hosted at their recently acquired retail subsidiary, First Heritage Bank. Corporate didn't call Bradley's desk. They called the regional vice president, Carol Ostrander. They told her that the Federal Reserve was auditing a major shareholder's compliance file, and they needed an immediate verified Know Your Customer update on Marcus Webb. When Carol pulled up Marcus's profile in the system, she saw the red flag, an internal note from exactly 11 days prior, detailing that Mr. Webb had walked into the Greensboro branch with an account statement only to be turned away by the branch manager for trying to discuss his portfolio. According to everyone involved, Carol Ostrander was not thrilled. The system that let Marcus walk out the door unheard was the exact same system that 11 days later was legally required to verify his identity down to the absolute cent. Not because anyone suddenly had a change of heart, but because federal banking regulations don't care whether a retail branch manager respects you or not. By the time the regulatory review was completed and his position was fully verified, Marcus Webb's 9.8% stake in the newly uplisted NASDAQ bank was valued at just over $22 million. Let me say plainly, I don't think the moral of this story is penny stocks make you rich. They almost never do. For every Marcus Webb, there are thousands of accounts that went to absolute zero buying high-risk microcaps with the exact same level of conviction. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, and any financial video that tells you this is a repeatable get-rich-quick strategy is lying to you. What I do think is worth sitting with is something much quieter. Marcus didn't get rich because he found a magic loophole. He got rich because he behaved like an owner for 11 straight years, while everyone around him, including a man across a bank counter, treated him like he only had access to income. And income, especially in an economy where inflation has chipped away at real purchasing power for the better part of 2 decades, is a losing long game. Markets have rewarded asset ownership over labor for generations. The middle class isn't losing ground because people stopped working hard. It's losing ground because too many people are still playing an income-only game in a wealth rewards economy. Bradley Coons apologized, by the way. Carol Ostrander made sure of that personally. From what I understand, it was short, incredibly stiff, and exactly the kind of apology you'd expect from someone whose entire professional instinct just got publicly proven wrong by his own corporate compliance office. Marcus reportedly just nodded again. The exact same slow nod he gave when he was brushed off. He didn't gloat. People who've actually built something rarely do. The ones who need to loud talk their success usually haven't built much yet. Amara, when she's old enough to understand the mechanics of Wall Street and federal banking laws, is going to inherit something most kids in this country never get a real shot at: a head start that started with 38 cents, an old work jacket, and 11 years of absolutely nobody noticing. So here's the question I keep coming back to, and it's something every investor should ask themselves. How much quiet, real wealth is sitting in accounts at this exact moment, getting glanced at for 10 seconds and completely dismissed, not because it's worthless, but because the person looking at it didn't know how to read between the lines?